It was the summer of 1944. On a narrow volcanic island in the Central Pacific, a Japanese colonel crouched in a limestone cave and wrote a letter he believed no one would ever read. Outside, American naval guns had been firing for 3 days without pause. The coral hills above his position had been ground into chalk. His regiment, which had numbered over 3,000 men when they arrived on the island, was now fewer than 400. Not because of tactical failures, not because his soldiers had broken or retreated, but because an enemy he had been told to expect in single batches had arrived in thousands, and when each batch died, another had appeared the next morning, exactly on schedule, fed by a horizon full of ships that never seemed to empty. He had studied Americans before the war. He had read the intelligence summaries, the propaganda assessments, the cultural analyses that described them as soft, individualistic, and unwilling to absorb casualties for a cause they did not personally believe in. He had believed those assessments. Most Japanese commanders had. They were wrong about almost everything except one thing, and the one thing they got right terrified them more than anything else they had encountered. This is the story of what Japanese commanders actually said about fighting Americans, drawn from interrogation records, captured diaries, post-war testimonies, and the classified assessments that remained sealed for decades after the war ended. It begins not on a beach or a jungle trail, but in a room in Tokyo in the spring of 1942, where a group of senior Imperial Army officers sat around a table and tried to explain something that should not have been possible. The Imperial Japanese Army entered the Pacific War with reasons to be confident that bordered on certainty. It had been fighting in China since 1937 and had never lost a sustained campaign. Its infantry doctrine emphasized aggression, night operations, and the willingness to absorb casualties that Western armies considered unacceptable. The Bushido Code was not merely propaganda. It shaped tactical decisions at the individual soldier level in ways that genuinely alarmed the British and Dutch forces who encountered it first in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in late 1941 and early 1942. Japanese soldiers would charge positions that common military sense said were unassailable. They would hold ground until every man was dead rather than withdraw. They would go 3 and 4 days without food in terrain that American supply officers would have declared impassable. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who captured Singapore with 30,000 men against a defending force of 85,000, had concluded something from that victory that shaped Japanese strategic thinking for the first year of the war. He believed that willpower, properly organized and directed, could substitute for material advantage over a limited period and against a sufficiently demoralized enemy. What Japan needed was to win fast, win psychologically, and force a negotiated settlement before American industry could bring its full weight to bear. The plan was not unreasonable. It had worked against the British. It had worked against the Dutch. It had nearly worked against the Russians in 1905. The Japanese made one error in their calculation. They assumed that losing hurt Americans the way losing hurt other armies. It did not. The first indication that something was different came not from a battle the Americans won, but from a battle they lost. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces began their assault on Wake Island. The garrison consisted of 449 Marines, 68 naval personnel, and approximately 1,200 civilian contractors. They had no radar that was operational. Their air wing had been reduced to 4 Wildcats by Japanese bombing. They had no naval support within range. A Japanese amphibious force of 1,800 men expected to take the island within hours. Instead, the Marines repelled the landing, sank 2 Japanese destroyers, killed 700 Japanese soldiers, and forced the invasion fleet to withdraw. It was the first Japanese amphibious defeat of the war. Japanese commanders studied the engagement carefully. What concerned them was not the tactical outcome, but something quieter. Marines who had been under continuous bombing for 11 days, who had watched colleagues die, who had received no reinforcement and had no realistic prospect of rescue, had chosen to keep fighting. The decision was not ideological in the Japanese sense. The Marines were not dying for an emperor or a code. They were simply not done yet. That distinction, subtle and difficult to articulate in military intelligence terms, would define every encounter between Japanese and American forces for the next 4 years. The captured interrogation records from Guadalcanal, declassified in stages between the 1970s and the 1990s, and now held primarily at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, reveal a pattern that became more consistent as the war progressed. Japanese soldiers and officers captured in the early phases of Pacific fighting described American troops in terms that matched pre-war expectations. Individually brave but tactically naive. Well-equipped but dependent on their equipment in ways that suggested vulnerability if supply lines could be cut. Emotionally attached to their lives in a manner that Japanese doctrine interpreted as weakness. By 1943, the language in these same records had shifted. What Japanese officers kept returning to in different words and from different islands was the same observation the German prisoners were making simultaneously from different foxholes in Europe. Americans did not fight the way the manuals said they would fight, and the thing that made them most dangerous was not what they did with rifles. It was what they did with radios. Major Kumao Imoto served on the Imperial Army General Staff and was dispatched to Guadalcanal in December 1942 to conduct a personal assessment of why Japanese forces had been unable to recapture Henderson Field despite committing 5 major ground offensives and losing more than 20,000 men. His report described the problem with a precision that his superiors found difficult to accept. The Americans had constructed an artillery system that functioned as a single organism. A forward observer at the front of their line could direct the fires of guns positioned miles behind it within a time interval that Japanese forces had no practical means of exploiting. Japanese infantry attacking at night, which had been the primary tactical advantage of the entire Pacific campaign, found themselves illuminated by naval star shells and then immediately bracketed by artillery that had been pre-registered on likely avenues of approach during daylight. The advantage of darkness, which Imoto had once considered Japan's most reliable equalizer against American material superiority, had been partially negated by a communications infrastructure that operated effectively in conditions of zero visibility. He recommended withdrawal from the island. His superiors delayed the decision for 6 weeks. The delay cost 3,000 more lives. Captain Tsuneo Shimura, captured on Saipan in July 1944 and extensively interviewed at the prisoner interrogation facility on Guam, described an engagement that had defined his understanding of American combat capability. His company had broken through the American lines at night, reaching a position approximately 400 meters behind the main defensive line, a classic Japanese infiltration that had succeeded repeatedly in China and in the early Pacific campaigns. He expected confusion, disorder, and the psychological collapse that such penetrations had produced in other armies. Instead, within minutes of his company's presence being detected, artillery fire began falling on their position from multiple directions simultaneously. Not the slow, sequential adjustment of ranging shots and corrections that Japanese doctrine said to expect from a surprised enemy. An immediate coordinated concentration that Shimura described as arriving as if the Americans had known exactly where his men would be before they arrived. In his post-war testimony, Shimura said that experience changed the way his surviving officers discussed the war among themselves. They stopped talking about finding gaps in American lines. They started talking about whether gaps in American lines were deliberate, whether the Americans let Japanese forces penetrate specifically to concentrate artillery on them in open ground behind the main defensive position. He did not know whether that was true. It did not matter whether it was true. The fact that experienced Japanese officers were asking that question was itself the measure of how completely the tactical calculus had shifted. The Turkey Shoot, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japanese carrier aircraft lost approximately 550 planes against American losses of fewer than 130. By 1944, the average Japanese naval pilot entering combat had received approximately 275 hours of flight training. American pilots averaged more than 600 hours before their first combat mission. The gap was not philosophical. It was industrial. Fuel, aircraft, instructor hours, training facilities. These were the inputs that produced combat pilots, and Japan was running out of all of them at rates that American production had made irreversible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had visited the Ford River Rouge complex in Detroit, and what he saw shaped his strategic pessimism in ways that never left him. Japanese production figures for the entire war did not equal what American shipyards alone were producing annually by 1943. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, who survived the war and later co-authored one of the most important Japanese accounts of Pacific naval combat, described in post-war interviews the internal conversations among Japanese naval officers as the ratio of losses became unmistakable. The discussion was not about how to win. By mid-1944, officers who spoke honestly among themselves had largely stopped framing the question that way. The discussion was about what combination of sacrifices might produce losses painful enough to make America reconsider the price of total victory. It was in this context that the Kamikaze program emerged, not from fanaticism alone, but from a cold strategic calculation that conventional weapons at conventional exchange rates could not produce enough American casualties to change the political calculus in Washington. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima and understood the strategic situation with a clarity that his detailed defensive preparations made visible even to his enemies. Kuribayashi had served as a military attaché in the United States and Canada in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He wrote to his wife from Washington in 1928 that the United States was the last country Japan should ever fight, that its industrial and military potential was beyond anything Japanese strategists had fully confronted. He constructed 15 miles of tunnels, interconnected blockhouses, positions that could survive naval bombardment. The Marines who took Iwo Jima suffered nearly 7,000 killed and 20,000 wounded. It was the only battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties in absolute numbers. The island was secured. The B-29s that used its airfields flew missions against the Japanese home islands from March 1945 onward. Colonel Yahara, the senior staff officer of the 32nd Army on Okinawa and one of the few senior Japanese officers to survive the campaign, described the American logistical apparatus across 82 days of fighting as something that had no equivalent in his professional experience. Not just the volume of supplies arriving daily on American ships, though that volume exceeded anything he had imagined possible to sustain across open ocean. What struck him was the integration, the way naval gunfire, air support, and ground artillery functioned as a single coordinated system rather than three parallel systems that occasionally cooperated. American forward controllers moved with the front-line infantry and called fires with an authority and efficiency that suggested the entire system had been designed from the beginning around their position. Japanese doctrine had no equivalent concept, and Yahara believed that this architectural difference, more than any single advantage in equipment or production, explained the pace at which Japanese defensive lines dissolved under American pressure despite the tactical quality of individual Japanese units. The interrogation records from later in the war contain a different quality of observation than those from 1942 and 1943. By 1944 and 1945, senior officers who agreed to speak with American interrogators were more likely to offer systemic assessments. What Japanese commanders kept returning to in different words and from different islands was the same observation German prisoners had made in the secretly recorded conversations at Fort Hunt and Trent Park. The individual American soldier was not extraordinary. The system that armed and supported and replaced and resupplied and directed that soldier was something they had no framework for understanding, because it had been built by a civilization whose relationship to industrial production they had fundamentally and catastrophically misjudged. The colonel in the limestone cave finished his letter in the summer of 1944. He sealed it, addressed it to his wife, and placed it with his personal effects in the hope that someone would eventually find it. American forces took the island 11 days later. The letter was found, translated, and placed in an intelligence file where it remained classified for 30 years. When it was finally declassified and read by the historians who had spent careers studying the Pacific War, they noted that it contained nothing operationally valuable. No unit designations, no defensive plans, no information that would have changed any American decision. What it contained was the private reflection of a professional soldier who had studied his enemy carefully and had arrived at a conclusion he had not shared with his superiors because sharing it would have served no purpose. He wrote that he had expected to fight Americans and found instead that he was fighting a country, that the distinction had taken him 3 years and 2 islands to understand, and that he understood it too late to matter. The letter is held today at the National Archives. It is 17 pages, written in careful characters on paper that has become fragile with age. It is the record of a man trying to understand what had defeated him, and it reads like a testament to the oldest lesson in the history of armed conflict. What breaks an army is rarely what the army expected to fear.